The saloon door swung wide as Luke Morrison stumbled inside. His spurs clinked against the worn wooden floor, and the thick smell of tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey filled his lungs. The Golden Horseshoe Saloon in Cheyenne Creek, Wyoming territory was loud even though it was past midnight. Glasses clattered, men laughed too hard, and the air felt heavy with sweat and dust from the long cattle trails. Luke leaned against the bar for a moment, trying to steady himself. At 28, he was one of the finest bronc busters in the territory. Tall and lean, with sunburned skin and sharp blue eyes, he carried the look of a man who had spent most of his life beneath the open sky. His dark hair fell from beneath a battered hat, and trail dust clung to his shirt like a second skin. But tonight, those sharp eyes were blurred with whiskey. "Morrison!" a voice shouted from the corner. Luke turned and saw Jake Hartley waving him over to the poker table. Around it sat familiar faces. Jake Hartley himself, rich from cattle and loud about it. Samuel Blackwood, the town banker who liked to pretend he was a simple man of the frontier. And across from them sat Tom Snake Eye Sullivan, the slick gambler with cold gray eyes that never seemed to blink. Luke pushed himself off the bar and staggered toward them. "You boys looking to lose some money tonight?" he said with a crooked grin. Snake Eye smiled thinly. "Depends. You sure you can see the cards straight? A cowboy?" "I see well enough," Luke said, dropping into the empty chair. He dug into his vest pocket and pulled out the last of his wages. $20 from a month of work at Patterson Ranch. It was all he had, but the whiskey had already burned away his caution. The cards began to fall. At first, luck seemed to ride on Luke's shoulder. His pile of coins grew. He played bold, reckless even, raising bets when he should have folded. Somehow the cards kept favoring him. "Lady Luck's smiling on you tonight," Blackwood muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Luke laughed. "About time she noticed me." But luck has a way of turning without warning. As the night crawled toward morning, Luke's winnings disappeared. One bad hand followed another. The coins vanished. Then the bills. Soon the saddle on his horse joined the pile, then his rifle. By 3 a.m, Luke sat staring at an empty space in front of him. "I'm done," he said quietly, at pushing back his chair. Snake Eye leaned forward slowly. "Now hold on there, Morrison," he said. "A man like you doesn't walk away after a night like this." Luke narrowed his eyes. "I've got nothing left." The gambler's smile widened. "I'll loan you $100 for one more hand." The crowd around the table grew silent. $100 was a fortune for a cowboy. "What's the catch?" Luke asked. "Simple," Snake Eye said calmly. "If you lose, you do one thing I ask. No questions." Jake Hartley chuckled. "Careful, Luke. That man's got a twisted sense of humor." Luke's mind told him to walk away. Every instinct from years on the frontier screamed at him to leave that table. But pride and whiskey are dangerous companions. "Deal," he said. The cards were dealt. Luke picked up his hand slowly. 2 airs, kings and sevens. Not perfect, but strong enough. The betting grew fierce. Snake Eye raised. Luke called. New cards were drawn. Luke pulled another 7. A full house. His heart pounded as he pushed the borrowed money into the center, all in. The saloon fell silent. Snake Eye studied him for a long moment before matching the bet. "Show them," someone whispered. Luke laid down his cards. Full house, 7s over kings. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Snake Eye laughed. The gambler laid down his cards one by one. 4 queens. The room erupted. Luke felt the blood drain from his face. "Well," Snake Eye said, lighting a cigar slowly. "Looks like you lost, Cowboy." Luke stared at the cards as the truth crashed over him. He had lost everything. "And now," Snake Eye continued calmly, "about that condition." The saloon grew quiet again. "You know the widow Johnson?" the gambler asked. Luke nodded slowly. Everyone in Cheyenne Creek knew her. Amara Johnson, the young widow whose husband had died in a mine collapse 6 months earlier. Well, she lived alone near Copper Creek on the small piece of land her husband left behind. Snake Eye leaned back and blew a ring of smoke into the air. "You're going to marry her." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then laughter exploded across the saloon. Luke shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," Snake Eye replied smoothly. "You gave your word." Samuel Blackwood leaned forward with a satisfied smile. "And if she refuses," he added quietly, "I happen to hold the loan on her land. She marries you by the end of the week, or she loses everything." Luke suddenly understood. This had been planned from the beginning. He looked around the room and saw the cruel amusement in the faces staring back at him. 3 days later, Luke Morrison stood inside the small wooden church at the edge of Cheyenne Creek. The pews were packed with townsfolk eager to witness what they called the biggest joke of the year. Then the church door opened. Amara Johnson stepped inside. Luke had seen her from a distance before, but up close she took his breath away. She wore a simple blue dress carefully mended at the seams. And her dark hair was tied neatly behind her head, but it was her eyes that held him. Deep brown. Proud. Unbroken. She walked down the aisle with her head held high despite the laughter echoing through the church. When she reached the altar, Luke spoke softly. "I'm sorry about this." She didn't look at him. "We both know why we're here," she said calmly. "Let's just finish it." The ceremony was quick. The laughter from the pews never stopped. When Reverend Mills finally said the words that made them husband and wife, the church bells rang across the valley. Luke looked at Amara. She looked back at him. Two strangers tied together by a cruel game neither of them had chosen. As they stepped out into the bright Wyoming sunlight, Luke leaned closer and whispered quietly, "Cowboy lost a bet and got himself a bride." Amara studied his face carefully. Luke gave a small, tired smile. "But maybe," he said softly, "the game isn't over yet." Luke Morrison's cabin stood alone on the wide Wyoming prairie, 5 miles from Cheyenne Creek. The small wooden house looked even smaller beneath the endless sky. Wind whispered through the dry grass and rattled the loose boards on the porch. It had never felt lonely to Luke before. But now, with another person standing in the doorway, the cabin felt strangely tight. Amara stood just inside the door, her silhouette outlined by the fading evening light. And she held a small carpet bag, the only thing she had been allowed to bring from the life she once had. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. A rough wooden table stood near the stove. A few shelves held plates and supplies. A single bed rested in the corner. "It's not much," Luke said quietly as he lit a kerosene lamp. The warm yellow light filled the room. "I've seen worse," Amara replied calmly. Her voice was steady, but Luke could feel the tension between them. And neither of them had chosen this life. Neither of them knew what to say. Luke scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn tonight." "No." The word came quickly. Luke looked up in surprise. "If you sleep in the barn, people will talk," Amara said. "They are already waiting for us to fail. I won't give them the satisfaction." Luke studied her in the lamplight. Even in the plain dress she wore, there was something strong about her presence. Something proud. "All right," he said. "Then I'll sleep by the stove." Amara nodded slightly. They moved quietly around the cabin, each trying not to disturb the other. Luke spread blankets on the floor near the stove, while Amara unpacked her small bag. Luke noticed how carefully she handled each item: a worn Bible, a silver hairbrush, a small photograph. When she pulled out a beautifully stitched quilt, Luke raised an eyebrow. "You make that?" Amara looked at him with mild surprise. My mother taught me," she said softly. "Her mother taught her." Luke nodded slowly. "It's fine work." For a moment, the silence between them softened. Later that night, the cabin went dark, except for the fading glow from the stove. Luke lay on his blankets, staring at the wooden beams above him. From the bed, he could hear Amara shifting quietly. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Mr. Morrison." "Luke," he corrected gently. Seems silly to keep using formal names now." She paused before answering. "Luke, then." He waited. "I want something clear between us." Luke turned his head slightly toward the bed. "This marriage may be forced," she said carefully, "but I will never be forced in any other way." Luke sat up slightly. "I understand," he said quickly. "You don't owe me anything." Another silence followed. After a moment, Amara spoke again. "I thank you." Morning arrived with pale sunlight creeping through the window cracks. Luke woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement. Amara was already awake, tending the stove. "You didn't have to do that," Luke said, rubbing his eyes. "I don't live for free," she replied. They ate a quiet breakfast of biscuits and bacon. Luke noticed she took only a small portion. "We need supplies," Luke said. "Clothes, too. Winter's coming." Amara stiffened slightly. "I have what I need." "No, you don't," Luke replied firmly. "You're my wife now, at least by law. That means we share what we have." She looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Luke shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do." An hour later, they rode toward town. Luke rode his bay horse, while Amara rode the gentler mare. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, golden grass rolling in the wind. Purple mountains rose far away under the bright Wyoming sky. "You ride well," Luke said, after watching her for a while. "My husband taught me," she replied quietly. Luke nodded respectfully. "He sounds like a good man." He was. The conversation ended there. But when they reached Cheyenne Creek, people had already gathered along the wooden boardwalks. Word had spread quickly about the strange marriage. Whispers followed them everywhere. Luke ignored the stares and walked with Amara into Henderson's general store. "Pick what you need," he said. Amara hesitated, but began examining the fabrics. A gentle voice suddenly spoke behind them. "That blue wool will last longer than the calico." They turned to see Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the rancher's wife, and she smiled warmly at Amara. "It's good fabric for winter." "Thank you," Amara said softly. Mrs. Patterson nodded kindly. "My husband speaks highly of Luke. You chose a hard-working man, Mrs. Morrison." It was the first time anyone had spoken to Amara with respect since the wedding. Luke saw the surprise in her eyes. They finished shopping and returned to the horses. As they rode home, the prairie wind carried the smell of sage across the open land. When they reached the cabin, Luke prepared dinner while Amara unpacked the supplies. As they ate, the tension between them slowly eased. "You're not what I expected," Amara admitted. Luke chuckled slightly. "What did you expect?" "Someone cruel," she said honestly. Luke leaned back in his chair. "I was angry that night in the saloon," he admitted. "Still am at those men." He looked at her across the table. "But not at you." Amara studied him quietly. "Maybe we can survive this after all," she said. "Maybe we can do better than survive," Luke replied. Days passed, and life slowly settled into a rhythm. Amara worked beside Luke like a true partner. She helped repair fences, gather eggs, and tend the small garden beside the cabin. Luke found himself watching her more often than he expected. She was strong, capable, proud. 2 weeks later, before dawn, Luke woke suddenly. The sound of galloping horses thundered across the prairie. He grabbed his rifle and looked through the window, and 5 riders were circling the cabin. Horse thieves. "Amara," Luke whispered, but she was already awake, shotgun in hand. A rough voice shouted from outside. "Morrison, come out nice and easy. We'll take your horses and maybe leave the cabin standing." Luke felt anger rise inside him. Then another voice shouted something uglier. "Maybe we'll take the colored wife too." Before Luke could react, a shotgun blast exploded from the cabin window, while one of the riders screamed and fell from his horse. Amara stood beside the window, calm and steady. "The next shot goes through your heart," she called. The thieves hesitated. Luke stared at her in shock. "Cover the front," he whispered. She nodded. Luke's Abepo slipped out the back door, circling wide through the brush. He knocked one man unconscious near the horses and drove the others away before they could burn the barn. By sunrise, the thieves were gone. Luke returned to the cabin. Amara lowered the shotgun slowly. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. "You saved us," Luke said. She shook her head. "We saved each other." They sat together on the porch as the sun rose over the Wyoming plains. For the first time since their forced marriage, the silence between them felt peaceful. Luke glanced at her. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think that poker game might have been the luckiest loss of my life." Amara looked at him sideways, when a small smile touched her lips, and something new began to grow between them. Not forced, not expected, but real. The weeks that followed changed everything between Luke Morrison and Amara Johnson Morrison. At first, their days had simply been about survival. 2 strangers forced into the same cabin, working side by side because they had no other choice. But slowly, something deeper began to grow between them. The tension that once filled the cabin faded, and in its place came a quiet understanding. Each morning, Amara woke before the sun. She lit the stove, brewed coffee, and stepped outside into the cool Wyoming air. The prairie stretched endlessly around the cabin, golden grass moving in waves beneath the rising sun. Luke would already be in the barn tending the horses, and when he walked back toward the house, he always paused for a moment. He liked watching her in that early light. There was strength in the way she carried herself. Pride, too. Even after everything she had endured, nothing about her seemed broken. Amara noticed his quiet glances but said nothing. Instead, she poured him coffee, and they shared breakfast at the small wooden table. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. One morning, Luke was repairing the fence near the pasture when Amara walked out to help him. She carried a bundle of wire and tools. "You don't have to do that," Luke said. "I know," she replied. "But partners help each other." The word hung in the air. Partners. Luke felt something warm settle inside his chest. Later that afternoon, the sound of hooves echoed across the prairie. Luke looked up from the fence line and saw riders approaching. Sheriff Ben Carter led the group. Behind him rode Tom Patterson and several other ranchers from the valley. Luke wiped the dust from his hands as they stopped near the cabin. "Everything all right?" Luke asked. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Found 3 bodies out on the prairie this morning," Carter said. Looks like those horse thieves you ran off." Luke exchanged a glance with Amara. "The storm must have caught them," Luke replied quietly. The sheriff studied both of them for a moment. "Well," Carter finally said, "seems to me you folks did what you had to do. The riders left soon after, and the prairie fell silent again. That evening, Luke and Amara sat together on the porch steps watching the sunset. But the sky burned with shades of orange and purple as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. "You handled that shotgun like a soldier," Luke said. "My husband taught me," Amara replied. Luke nodded. "He must have been proud of you." She looked out across the land. "He believed I could survive anything." Luke turned toward her. He was right. Amara studied him for a moment before asking a question that had been quietly waiting between them. "Why did you never marry before this?" Luke leaned back against the porch rail. "Never met the right woman," he said after a moment. "Most women wanted a different life. A townhouse, fancy clothes, a man who stayed close to home." He looked around the wide open prairie. "I belong out here." Amara smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you simply hadn't met the right partner yet." The word echoed again. Partner. Luke felt his heartbeat quicken. That night, something changed. Well, for weeks, Luke had slept on blankets by the stove, while Amara took the bed. But as they prepared to sleep, she stopped him. "This is foolish," she said gently. Luke looked up. "The bed is large enough for two. We can place a blanket between us if it makes you more comfortable." Luke hesitated. Then he nodded. They arranged the bed carefully with a folded blanket dividing it down the middle. At first, the silence felt heavy again. Both of them lay awake, aware of the other's presence. But exhaustion soon pulled them into sleep. And when morning came, neither of them mentioned the blanket barrier. Days passed. The partnership between them grew stronger. They worked together repairing fences, expanding the garden, and preparing the homestead for winter. The townspeople noticed too. The laughter and cruel whispers that once followed them slowly faded. In their place came respect. Even Mrs. Henderson at the general store began greeting Amara politely. But trouble had not disappeared completely. One cold evening, a group of riders approached the cabin again. This time, they carried torches. Luke and Amara took positions at the windows with rifles ready. The men outside shouted threats and demanded they surrender the land. Before Luke could respond, another sound filled the night. More horses. Dozens of them. Sheriff Carter and the Valley Ranchers rode in from every direction. Within minutes, the attackers were surrounded. Luke stepped outside beside Amara and watched as the sheriff placed the men in chains. The danger that had once threatened their lives was finally gone. That night, the cabin was filled with neighbors celebrating the victory. Laughter and music echoed across the prairie long after dark. When the guests finally left, Luke and Amara stood quietly outside beneath the stars. The sky above Wyoming stretched endlessly, bright with thousands of stars. Luke turned toward her. "There's something I should have said a long time ago," he said. Amara looked at him curiously. Luke took a slow breath. "That night in the saloon, I thought losing that bet ruined my life." He stepped closer, but somewhere along the way, something changed. Amara's eyes softened. Luke reached for her hand. "I don't know when it happened," he continued quietly. "Maybe when you stood beside me against those thieves. Maybe when you called us partners." He smiled. But I know this much." He looked straight into her eyes. "I fell in love with my wife." For a moment, Amara said nothing. Then tears gathered in her eyes. "I wondered if you ever would," she whispered. Luke blinked in surprise. "You knew?" Amara smiled through her tears. "I think I began loving you the day you stood up for me in town." The wind moved softly across the prairie as Luke pulled her into his arms. Their first true kiss happened beneath the wide Wyoming sky. No laughter, no cruel voices, just two people who had fought through everything life had thrown at them. When they finally stepped back, Luke laughed quietly. "Well," he said, "I guess the joke's on Snake Eye after all." Amara tilted her head. "How so?" Luke grinned. "I lost a bet and married the most incredible woman in the territory." Amara laughed softly. "And I was forced to marry a stubborn cowboy who turned out to be the husband of my dreams." They stood together looking across the land that had nearly destroyed them both, but instead it had given them something far greater: a home, a partnership, and a love neither of them had expected. Sometimes the worst night of a man's life becomes the beginning of the best story he will ever live.